Hello. In history, we study what happened in the past, the unfolding of certain events in a certain order so that we can better understand the world that we live in today.
It's always important to study what actually happened, but it is interesting to look at what might have happened if just a few things went differently.
This can be a dangerous game as it gets you into the realm of the counterfactual, the hypothetical world of what-if scenarios that are counter to reality and therefore impossible to analyze because they never actually happened.
However, sometimes considering what could have happened can help us to deepen our understanding of what actually did happen, which is what we seek to do in this video when we consider the question, was the Civil War inevitable?
The short answer is yes, because the Civil War did happen. So it's impossible to test those other possible outcomes.
But again, in considering this question, perhaps we can gain some insight into why the Civil War happened, as well as some of the key events that led to the Civil War happening the way that it happened. So let's start doing that now.
The United States demonstrated its ability to compromise on issues such as slavery since the country's founding.
At the Constitutional Convention, the framers from the northern and southern states compromised on the issue of slavery. Even though the northern states had already begun emancipating their slaves, they allowed slavery to happen in the South because they knew that they had to in order to hold the Union of States together.
In 1820, Missouri asked to enter the Union as a slave state. At the time, this was considered a crisis because it would disrupt the balance between free and slave states. However, the U.S. government was able to compromise by adding Missouri as a slave state and then adding Maine as a free state to maintain the balance. The U.S. government saw the need to prevent future conflicts like this one, so they drew the 36th parallel line west of the southern border of Missouri, permitting slavery below the line but not above it. Had they continued to follow that rule, perhaps a war would not have been fought.
But in 1854, Kansas and Nebraska were organized into territories, and residents were allowed to decide whether slavery would be permitted there or not. This essentially voided the Missouri Compromise and the 36th parallel line because both of those territories were above the line.
Had the United States genuinely pursued compromise and followed the rules that they set out in those compromises, as they had done for about 75 years, war could have been avoided.
To say that the Civil War was inevitable is kind of to say that the Civil War was necessary in order to abolish slavery. But there is some reason to believe that even without a war, slavery would have went away on its own anyway. It's undebatable that slavery is completely contradictory to American ideals like liberty, equality, and inalienable rights. So it seems reasonable to believe that as the nation continued to make progress towards these ideals and towards its goal of forming a more perfect union, that the South would eventually have determined on its own that slavery had to go. After all, by the start of the Civil War, slavery had already been abolished in most of Europe, including Great Britain in 1833, and they didn't need to fight a civil war to do it. It's clear that the South was not ready to give up slavery in the year 1861, the year the Civil War began. But abolitionist sentiment had been growing around the country for decades, and the writing was kind of already on the wall. The abolition of Southern slavery may not have been imminent in 1861, but it definitely seems that the institution was destined to grow weaker through a process of gradual abolition in the years and decades ahead. Had the election of 1860 not spooked Southern states into secession, perhaps that's what would have happened.
Lincoln never publicly stated that slavery should abolish where it already existed. He was really only advocating that slavery should not be added to future new states and territories. Lincoln never publicly spoke out against the Fugitive Slave Act. And even in private, he wrote, "I confess, I hate to see poor creatures hunted down, but I bite my lips and keep quiet." Doesn't sound like much of an abolitionist, does it? Abraham Lincoln spoke out against abolitionists like John Brown, who broke the law and used violence to stop slavery. And if Lincoln was okay with slavery, maybe there didn't need to be a civil war.
So secession was inevitable, but not necessarily war. For example, before the Battle of Fort Sumter, the South gave an ultimatum to the people that were manning the fort. They could have given up Fort Sumter and that there would have been actually no bloodshed. And who knows what would have happened after that if there was no original battle that was a fight for that territory. Also, just like today, not everybody agrees on everything. So support for the Civil War in the North was not universal. For example, there were Copperheads and Peace Democrats that did not support the war. What they proposed was an immediate peace deal with the South to avoid bloodshed at all costs because they did not feel that the Civil War was worth it. People could have listened to these individuals and prevented the North from even fighting in the first place. Another possibility to avoid war would have been the fact that economically the war just didn't make sense. So, for example, the South produced 75% of the world's cotton. European nations were getting wealthy from Southern cotton. They could have convinced the North to go along with Southern secession just to keep business going as usual. There was many rich Northern factory owners that wanted to keep business going as usual without having the huge cost of a war. It cost the North $5.2 billion to fight the Civil War. For that amount of money, they literally could have paid for and freed every slave in the South. So economically speaking, the war was not a good business deal.
However, the Civil War did happen, and ironically, the document that has been cited as such a great source of compromise in this country's history might have also been the document that made the Civil War inevitable. The Constitution created a bicameral legislature with both a House and a Senate. And while representation in the House was based off states' population, representation in the Senate was allocated equally between the states, no matter how many or how few people lived in those states. This meant that even though there were way more people in the North, a minority of Southerners could block legislation meant to undermine slavery. What is more, the infamous 3/5 compromise, which allowed Southern states to count slaves in determining their state's representation in Congress, even though obviously those slaves had zero voice in their state's government, meant that the voices of Southern proponents of slavery were disproportionately inflated in the House of Representatives as well. And it also gave them added electoral votes when it came to presidential elections. These constitutional compromises, which were negotiated by slaveholders, meant that even if a vast majority of the country had determined that it wanted to get rid of slavery, a small Southern minority would always be able to obstruct those efforts. And if you can't get rid of slavery through legislation, perhaps that makes war a more likely option.
Westward expansion of the United States made the Civil War inevitable. With each new territory and state added, the question of slavery was brought back to the surface.
As the U.S. expanded west, Northerners worried that the Southerners would extend their influence and their peculiar institution of slavery into those Western territories. Southerners worried that if those territories were added as free states, then the free states would have greater representation in Congress. And if they had a greater representation in Congress, they could abolish slavery altogether.
While Congress was able to cultivate a temporary compromise in the Missouri Crisis of 1820, they would be unable to maintain that balance of free and slave states forever. When California asked to enter the Union as a free state in 1849, tensions flared again. Although the Compromise of 1850 was able to push forward with an agreement, it wasn't without conflict. Two senators that disagreed about this compromise actually had a brawl on the Senate floor and a pistol was drawn. Luckily, no one got hurt, but violence was already erupting amongst the decision makers of our nation.
When the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed settlers in those territories to decide on the issue of slavery for themselves, Northerners were outraged because Kansas and Nebraska were above the 36th parallel line, so according to the Missouri Compromise, they should have been free. Fighting broke out between pro-slavery sympathizers and abolitionists in Kansas in 1854, earning it the nickname Bleeding Kansas.
Tensions and violence were rising to the surface with each new territory organized. Eventually, a boiling point would be reached between North and South with the outbreak of the Civil War.
I believe that the Civil War was inevitable. One reason being the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was an individual who lived for 4 years in territories that were free territories: Illinois, Wisconsin, and even Minnesota, which by definition should make a person be free. After all, how can someone be enslaved in a state where slavery is illegal? The Supreme Court, in one of their worst rulings of all time, ruled that Dred Scott didn't have standing to sue. Since Dred Scott wasn't a citizen, he was not allowed to bring a lawsuit, even if it meant gaining his own freedom. What this ruling did is it essentially gave Southerners the right to bring their slaves wherever they wanted, including free states, which basically superseded the laws in free states, basically allowing slavery anywhere. This ruling basically guaranteed conflict between the North and the South. At the time, abolitionists in the North were increasingly becoming aware of the horrors that were slavery, and it almost guaranteed that slavery could end up not just in the South, but in their own backyard, which, for many abolitionists and many in the North, meant violence wasn't just inevitable, it was actually justified.
Abe Lincoln was not the South's president. He didn't win a single Southern state and didn't even appear on the ballot in 10 states. I mean, he only received 40% of the vote. The demographics of the election showed both Northerners and Southerners alike that the era of Southern political dominance was over. By the time of Lincoln's inauguration, 7 states had already seceded and formed the Confederate States of America. The South never even gave Lincoln a chance.
There's no way to undo or redo history. The Civil War happened, and any speculation about whether or not it was inevitable or what the country might have looked like if it hadn't happened is simply, well, speculation.
Speculating on what might have happened, for better or worse, also shows the importance of the events that actually did happen.
It shows the impact that certain decisions or events can have in shaping history's trajectory, which shapes the historical narrative that we study today.
And in turn, it also shows us the significance of decisions being made and events taking place in the world right now, and how our own actions as people living in the present will forever alter the history that people study in the future. Thanks for watching.
Hello.
And in turn, it also shows us this. And in turn, it also shows us the significance. That's hard to say.
However, considering what could have happened, that's hard.
Oh, it's good.
And in turn, it also shows us that. And in turn, it also shows us the significance. And in turn, it also shows us the significance of decisions being.
By the time Lincoln officially took office, 7 states had already seceded and formed the Confederates. What is it? The Confederate States? States of America. All right.
And in turn, it also shows us the significance of decisions being made.
Hello. Right? Damn it. Damn it. Damn it. Take out several of those damn it's. Maybe not all of them.
And while it's always important to study what actually happened, it is fun to play the what if game. And I forgot what the fuck this
Luckily, no one was hurt, but clearly we can see those tensions and violence erupting in terms of, okay.
Oh, you were so close.